for being here. Let me welcome you all on behalf of the people there, which are actually the researchers of the European Institute on Economics and the Environment. I will guide you through this first part of the event, and we'll start with Matteo Bartolomeo, who is the president of BASE.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you all. I'm very honored on behalf of my colleagues and the community of BASE to have you here today. And a special welcome to Professor Nordhaus, and special welcome for this launching event to the European Institute for Economics and Environment. I would like to spend a few words about BASE, just to let you know why you are here and what is happening in this place. And I would like to start by thanking the municipality of Milan. The municipality of Milan is the owner of this infrastructure and has provided some years ago, together with infrastructure, I think a very interesting and innovative policy framework for a public and private partnership where BASE is the counterpart. And in addition to that, I think the municipality of Milan supported since the beginning this project called BASE, which was started about 4 years ago by a small group of 5 organizations dealing with environmental and social innovation, with culture, with urban regeneration, and inclusion. A very small organization that took the challenge of renovating this building and conducting a number of activities, I don't have time to explain which ones, for 18 years. So we made a quite significant investment for the city, 14 million euros of investment, and we took the responsibility of conducting this building and this activity for 18 years. Now, in this building and this industrial compound, this hosted industrial activities since 1904 and up to more or less the end of the 80s last century. And here, the activities that we're doing are related to the production of electrical and mechanical components, large components such as, trains, turbines, but also weapons during the Second World War. And as the heavy industry left and moved away from the city center, BASE, together with the municipality of Milan, took the challenge of establishing a new kind of industry here. So an industry made of individuals, of professionals, and activities related to art, culture, creativity, innovation, and also policy design. So heavy industry went away, and knowledge-intensive activities, such as the ones related to creative industry, took place and flourished in this place. So this is the reason why I welcome very, very much. I'm very glad to have here in this building, not just for today, but for the main offices, the European Institute for Economics and Environment, which is for us, I think, I would say, a symbol, a contemporary symbol of a knowledge-intensive organization. So very much connected to the present of BASE and this place rather than to the past. And I'm sure that in the coming years, possibly months, the European Institute will play a very important role and become a very important and significant pillar of BASE, of the making of BASE, which is very much a process rather than a project. So thanks to a very highly qualified research, thanks to a network, an international network of researchers worldwide, and thanks to the ability of this institute to connect and also to exert a very positive influence for a just, efficient, and effective environmental policy in Europe, and also, I would say, thanks to its role to make research, very hard research outcomes accessible to a wide public. So I would like to end on a very personal note, just before leaving the floor to all of you. I was a student of economics and environmental economics here in Milan. So I'm very, very happy and also a bit embarrassed for today. And I was, at the time of my thesis, I was very fascinated by the concept of externalities and the concept of also of market failure. And surprisingly, it turned that these concepts are very relevant also for the work that we are doing here at Basel, because it's all a matter of externalities at the end of the day. So externalities within a community, which is a very diversified community here at Basel, but also externalities between this community and Basel and the rest of the city and the other stakeholders on the other side. So, and I think at the end of the day that externalities can, and all the dialogue on and discussion about externalities with different points of views and also different policy priorities are really a good fabric to connect in this very fascinating journey, the European Institute for Economics and Environment and Basel. Thank you very much.
So I'm here again, and maybe I should tell you that my name is Valentina Bosetti, and I'm a professor at Bocconi University. I'm a senior scientist at EIE. And let me now introduce you, the second person. So you probably have noticed, or you will learn more about this. This institute comes from the interaction of two different pre-existing institutes. So I'll give the words to the CEO and president of RFF, Richard Newell, who will explain to us something about the first institute and why he decided to join with CMCC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valentina. It's really a pleasure to be here, and this is my first time visiting the location of the new institute, and I really want to thank Matteo Bartolomeo and Bassa for providing such a welcoming spirit here. It's incredibly creative space, you know, in this room and even along the sides as you see all the activity going on, bringing knowledge really to the service of society, and really pleased to hear about your background, which just reinforces what a wonderful place it is that we have here. I also want to thank the partners that have joined with us at Resources for the Future in creating the European Institute on Economics and the Environment, Antonia Navarro, who you'll hear from, and Carlo Carrero, and Massimo Tavoni, and Valentina Bossetti, and Francesco Bosello, really an incredible group of people. When I reflect on you know, why we're doing this, you know, what is the purpose of launching this institute, there's really three key reasons. There's mission and history alignment. That's the first one. The second one is really complementary expertise that we're bringing together here so that the sum of what we're creating is bigger than the sum of the parts, the whole. And third, and most importantly, ultimately, is that the impact that we can have through this institute, I think, is we're already seeing it, and the potential is even greater. And the problems that we are working on are incredibly important, not just to each of our countries and our communities, but also to the planet. And we'll be hearing about this also in the panel discussion and the address by Bill Nordhaus later, which I'm really looking forward to. So first on mission, for those of you who don't know Resources for the Future, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution located in Washington, D.C. We've been working in the United States and also abroad since 1952. So we've been at this for 7 decades. Much of the formative thinking about how one thinks about our environment, our natural resource base, and our energy system from an economic perspective has really been developed over many decades with Resources for the Future, working with the economics community across the world to really advance our understanding of the interaction of the economy and the environment and how we can improve that interaction. How we can improve that interaction by thinking and putting into economic terms things that we value in the environment that might not otherwise be valued, by creating policy instruments that can harness the power of private incentives in support both of economic development but also of environmental protection, and increasingly working on problems like global climate change that are important really to the future of humanity. RFF's mission is to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions, and to do this through impartial economic research and policy engagement. So really, we're committed to being the most widely trusted source of research insights and policy solutions to support both a healthy environment and a thriving economy. So the first key reason why it made sense for us to launch this European Institute is because we found in the people that you see here at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change and the researchers that are now part of the Institute, an alignment of mission and purpose, that the pre-existing purpose to which these individuals have been putting their professional careers is very much aligned in the spirit of bringing the scientific expertise and economic expertise to helping solve very important societal problems. History, I've given you a little bit of RFF's history, which goes several decades. Actually, our history of interaction with the people who are part of the European Institute on Economics and the Environment also goes back several decades. So we are not new to one another. There's a deep shared set of values and professional experiences which relate to much of it around international climate policy. We see one another in many different professional fora, so the groups of individuals are not new to one another, and so we have a lot of confidence in how we can work together to make even more impact. The second major reason is our complementary expertise. So we have both distinctive expertise at the two institutions as well as significant intersection where we can find very clear synergies. So clearly, being in the United States, we have a significant orientation on North America, both in terms of US federal policy, but also state-level policy in the United States. We're also very active throughout North America, Canada, Mexico. We have been, particularly on issues like global climate change and international environment and development, we have been engaged historically, but I would say relative to our European counterparts, they will be bringing great strength in expertise and interaction in the European community, and also, very importantly, in the international climate policy dialogue. So there you have a coming together, bridging across the Atlantic with mutually reinforcing expertise. We also have very complementary expertise in terms of the scientific and modeling and empirical expertise that we bring to the issues that we work on, ranging particularly importantly around climate, but also other aspects of the energy system and environmental policy. The ultimate purpose here is that we help to make the world a better place. And so ultimately, we entered into this because we think that together we can have more impact. Impact on helping to bring new solutions, new ideas, opportunities for convening and bringing people together so that they can find common ground, that we can introduce new ideas, new facts, new solutions into the process so that we can advance society's abilities to grapple with incredibly difficult and important problems like climate change. Really, to sum up, I'm thrilled that we're here today. We're off to a fantastic start, but I think that you're really just will witness today the beginning of what's going to be a long-standing and very fruitful partnership, something that hopefully we can all feel really good about and positive about, given some of the less positive things we see within the international arena. I think we should all really support and celebrate opportunities like this where we come together and make progress, hopefully to benefit us all. Thank you very much.
So now we will hear from the Italian counterpart, Antonia Navarra, President of CMCC.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank again to all the team in Milan for organizing this opportunity for discussion, for presentation of what we are doing here. It's been a tremendous journey, a very nice experience, and I have to thank everybody, but I have to thank our founders at CMCC. CMCC is a foundation of universities and research institutions. Our founders, like the University of Salento, University of Sassari, and University of Tuscia, and also the Politecnico di Milano, and the Institute for Geophysics and Volcanology, have all reacted enthusiastically at the idea of this initiative. So I have to thank them for their support. I also have to thank the team at CMCC, and especially our executive director, Laura Panzera, that I know is here. They worked very hard to implement this concept that was relatively new, and so we had to overcome a number of issues that finally brought us here. CMCC was born about 10 years ago with a very clear mission. We were supposed to investigate climate change and their impacts from the definition of a numerical model of the physical world to the definition of the economic models and policy analysis. So it was one of the first cases of an integrated research center on this issue in the world. And I think we have developed that concept over these years in a very satisfactory way. But we were missing, in some sense, the possibility of integrating our research, our network, in a much wider context. So the opportunity offered by the collaboration with RFF is really giving us the opportunity of enlarging our pool of talent, and human resources are the most precious resources that we have. Talent is very rare, must be protected, and must be supported. And therefore, when we found some more talent, the first priority is to try to engage it in a very meaningful way. We also have to bring the complementary concept. Richard has basically, I could agree with the 99.999% has increased since last time, but about 1,000th of the thing that he said. I would say that one thing I can add is that we have, of course, very relevant expertise in the European theater, but the expertise in the US and North American theater that FFS is bringing, I think, is added value that is much more than the sum of these two parts. So I'm really looking forward to this exciting adventure. It's a new adventure. We're pushing a new concept here. We are very proud of having offered the fabric of CMCC to support this initiative. Again, it's a new idea. I think there's a lot of potential. I can see a lot of enthusiasm here, and I'm pretty confident we're out to make very good things. Just to sum up, one thing I would like to say is that there is another idea in the background of this initiative. We're faced with a global international problem. And I think it's also time for the international academic and research community to recognize that fact. In some sense, to attack an international problem, we need international research organization. And this is one step in understanding and advancing that concept. So I'm really looking forward now to the lecture, to the domain of the debates today. And thanks again for the time and the opportunity.
Okay, but then what is it that we're talking about? What is this center? Massimo Tavoni, professor at Politecnico di Milano and director of the center, will tell us what this center is about.
So thanks for being here. It's really emotional for me to see all of you, a lot of known faces, and other people that I don't know very well. So bear with me for some more time. I know everyone wants to listen to Bill, and I have the difficult task of being just before Bill Nordhaus' talk, but I think I have some important things that I would like to share with you on what is and why myself, and also on behalf of Francesco Bosello, Professor Bosello is here, also as a co-director of this center, we think that this center can really provide in a very innovative and very novel way. So, you know, this is one of the pictures.
I'm a climate scientist at NASA's Goddard
Yeah, you can
Space
turn off
Flight
the
Center.
volume. Okay,
What
thanks.
you're looking at is a supercomputer model of carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere.
Can you turn off the...
The visualization compresses
No, can
1
turn
year
it
of
off.
data.
I know he's more talented than I am in speaking about climate science, but I think this picture is, you know, is beautiful and is terrifying in many ways, and it tells you a lot of things. It's a simulation about CO2 concentration in the air. Okay, so you see a lot of things here. You see CO2 is related to economic activity. That's why we need a center studying the relation between climate and the economy. Where is it coming from? Where the production and where the economy is. It tells you a lot about inequality as well, some of the parts contributing very little to the problem of climate change and yet suffer the consequences. It also gives you a lot of value to the ecosystems. Look at the rainforest in Brazil, Congo, and Indonesians, and you see how they pulse and they live, and they make possible to absorb and counterbalance what we are doing ourselves. You can also see how this is such a global problem. Emissions come from some places, and yet they move around the world, and ultimately the impact of climate change is felt everywhere, and actually in some places even more than the others. And this tells you about the consequences and obviously the challenges of facing such a big global dilemma. So what shall we do to address this? If you're in this room, I believe you care about climate change. That's my assumption. And you're not alone. There's a multi-front call for action about climate. And we've seen in the Fridays for the Future. Here we have the baby protesters It's a new breed of new species of humans going to the streets, in this case of Milano a few weeks ago, obviously co-opted by parents who are environmental and climate concerned parents, and put the big standing on RFF in front of them for some publicity, but certainly is showing that this is an important topic, and we saw it certainly also in the past few weeks. It's not just people. We have, certainly a lot of governments, and we're going to hear it more. European Commission is certainly committing towards going ahead and reducing CO2 emissions. That's without a doubt. Maybe other countries are not doing as much, but Europe has a certain path. It has decided it's going to go ahead. It's not just countries. We have cities now acting. The C40, of which Milan is one of a party, is one such example. And what you've seen in the recent years, and we're going to hear about it today as well, and which is really new, I think, is also companies. Companies coming to us, concerned about how climate change will affect their business, and concerned on how the transition to a low-carbon society will change their strategies. And they want to know from us what's going to happen, and what can you tell us useful for us to formulate strategy which is robust and resilient. And so how should we do all of this? Well, we heard we have these two institutes, and they're great. Everyone who's done environmental economics knows RFF. Everyone in Italy who has worked on climate knows CMCC. The great thing is a partnership, so it's a wedding, very much a wedding. So we are celebrating a wedding today. It's a big wedding in terms of people attending it, for sure. And coming together in this transatlantic partnership that, as Antonia was saying, is very much needed, given that we're facing problems that we just saw before are not certainly limited to one country or one region. And the mission is in line with what Richard Newell said. Essentially, it's the same mission as to provide impartial, which means very strong and robust and good, high-quality research, economic research, to understand how we can solve our environmental problems. And how do we do it? It's a very difficult task. It might sound almost impossible to do. There's always one solution to this, and it's about the people. We don't hear very much talking about, especially in this country, about education and the role of high-level education and the researchers for making a better and more informed society. But it is thanks to a group like this that I think a center like this can succeed. I think, in my experience, this has a unique combination of skills, and is certainly the top institute in Italy, and certainly one of the top in Europe and in the world. And why is it so? Besides the beautiful faces, as you see, young, diverse, but it's also because it combines three key elements. One is scientific excellence, publishing in the top journals. You can look at the websites. Every other month there's a Nature publication or so. But also interdisciplinarity, so we come from very different backgrounds, and this is great, and we need this to solve the problems of climate change. And often this is difficult to do in other research institutes. However, you need a common language as well. Otherwise, no one understands each other, and not much progress can be made. And our common language is this kind of very science-focused common language, which we all speak, at least all the 34 people that you see listed here, speak fluently. So as a last thing, I could not refrain by just showing you some of the things that we can do. It's more technical and maybe natural leading towards what Bill Nordhaus will have to say. One example of A at work is just a simple case. What do we do? What we plan on doing? We start from things like this. This is a map of the economic impacts of climate change around the world. We ask ourselves how climate change will impact the economy and society and global inequality. Where and which regions and which parts of society will suffer the most consequences. And we come up with maps like this that tells you a lot of places will suffer a lot. Unfortunately, those places seem to be also the poorest places on Earth right now, which is not a good indication by itself. So if you look at something like this and use a lot of data, climate data, economic data, environmental data to build maps and analysis of this kind, then you immediately ask yourself, what can we do about it? And obviously, if you want to solve this, you have to change paradigm. And one of the things you have to do is certainly change investments. We hear a lot about investments. You need to do more investments in certain things, less investments in certain others. So you need investments in energy efficiency, in renewable sources. You need investment in a better grid, in storage. And of course, at the same time, you need less investments or divestments in fossil power generation, in fossil extractions. Now, this is still very aggregated. You might ask yourself, okay, how do we get these investments happening? Now, think about energy efficiency. That happens that a lot of people in our house, we often don't do a lot of energy efficiency renovations or investments, right? We don't do it because it's costly, it's a nuisance, I don't have time, it will pay off in the future. There we work with companies. This is an example of something we did with a large Italian company, energy company. In the past 2-3 years, for almost 500,000 households in the country, using insights from behavioral economics, from economics, to motivate people to save energy. And also we look at what extent these kind of interventions can help investing in new and more efficient technology. So you see, you go from these macro, global pictures to just things that affect households like yours and mine. With this, I stop and thank you. And then I leave the floor to Valentina as well for the poll. Or should I say something about it? You can do it, I'm sure you can do
that. Okay, now it's the time. So it's the time of the keynote speaker. His name is Bill Nordhaus. Basically, this is like, for a musician to introduce, I don't know, Bruce Springsteen or something like this. So Bill Nordhaus has a PhD from MIT. He is a professor at Yale. He received last year the Nobel Prize together with Paul Romer for, the specific reason is the introduction of an integrated assessment model of climate change. And you might have heard this, but, I'll just give you a sense of what it is. That's an abstraction, a model that tries to put together the struggle of humanity to improve welfare in time and the consequences of the economic activities that we undertake to improve welfare on the environment, on the climate system in particular. So that's what it did, and it's enough for a Nobel Prize. But there's something more that it did. I don't know, at the beginning, I don't know if he did it on purpose. Basically, what it did is he came up with this very simple, minimal, elegant model, which has become the standard. The standard, like in jazz music, okay? The standard is something everybody can play. And if I play the trumpet, I might use it to do a lot of trumpet solos, or I'll do improvisation, but I'll come back and I'll be able to talk with other musicians that are playing the same standard. So basically, I guess thanks also to the fact not only of the beautiful features of the model, but the fact that the model was online, available for everyone to get it and play with it. Basically, he created a language. And when you have a language, you have a community. And when you have a community, you're ready, or you're prepared to solve a problem. So I've finally understood, I've heard Bill's giving a lot of interesting talk, keynote speeches around the world, but then I've heard him giving a speech when he was thanking the Royal Highnesses of Sweden for the prize. And he was addressing the speech to his granddaughters. And then I realized while he had done it, he didn't do it, he didn't need to make the model available to everyone for his own fame, but he needed so that we had a language, so that at some point we'll be able to solve the problem. So I think, we want to thank you more than with the Nobel Prize. The floor is yours. I should have said something which I didn't say. If you have a question, you can use it's not there anymore, but you can use, can you put it back? You can use the link, and you can write down the question, and we are going to, it's not there anymore, so we'll show it to you later. You can use the link. One back. Thank you. And you can write down the question, and I will be your voice and give the questions or speak out the question for you at the end of the presentation. And here it is, paulev.com/Tavoni. You can use that on your phone and write down the question. Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with this audience, and I have many friends in the audience and who've welcomed me, but I particularly want to thank my friends Valentina Bossetti and Massimo Tavoni. We're the member of a community. I'm a member, all of us are a member of many communities, many institutions, but we are together the member of what is the Climate Integrated Assessment Modeling Community, which is an invisible college spread around the world. It's represented here in Milan. It's, as I said, all around the world. So what I'd like to talk about today, first I wanted to say something about institutions, which is what the talk is about. One of the recent, I would say, insights, or might even say discoveries in economics, is the importance of institutions. You think economists talk about markets all the time and other things, stock markets, money supply, so on. But one of the real important discoveries is how important institutions are in society, in economic development, and economic growth. And of course, being in Italy, we know that Italy is the home of this great institution called universities, which really has developed as the primary place around the world where scientific discoveries and learning are developed. But it's also particularly appropriate today, or I think particularly sweet, if I might use that term, that we're witnessing the birth of a new institution, maybe the wedding, but I like to think of it as the birth, where you have an institution brought together by a common cause, brought together by other institutions which have sponsored it and have given it both the intellectual and the moral support. So I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful occasion to see the birth of a new institution. We have too few great institutions around the world, so I hope that this small child of an institution will fulfill its possibilities. So what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about the problems we face in climate change. There's a whole range of issues, but I want to focus on one specific one, which is the international dimension, which is the place where we've made least progress in climate change. I think we've made many progress in climate modeling, understand mitigation, understand a fair amount about impacts, understand, thanks a lot to Europe about the role of different instruments such as cap and trade and carbon pricing. But where we haven't made much progress is in understanding the role of international institutions and what kind of international institutions are necessary in the climate area. So that's my theme today. If I go to we'll start, maybe I'll back up. I'm not sure if this is out of place or not, so let me just see if it is. Yes, no, I'll go back, I'm sorry. So let me summarize what I'm going to say. There are four things I want to say. The first is the climate science is solid. I mean, we don't need to, I'll spend a little time on showing some of it, but I think we don't need to have that debate, and particularly in that community. There are people who want to have it, but we don't need to have it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have international institutions in place, or that have been in place, such as the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accord, and the Paris Accord, which are in the nation of voluntary international agreements. But the main message I want to bring today is that those are actually not going to work. They're a flawed concept about how to run an international agreement of this kind. The third point is, however, that there are international institutions, and we've seen them, and we have them in place, that are functional, not voluntary institutions, but one that have both obligations, responsibilities, and costs of non-participations. I call those clubs, but maybe you could use other kinds of words for it, but it's a kind of club structure. And those have been successful, and we've seen them successful in, actually the one I think of as the most successful is the European Union. And then the fourth thing I'll discuss at the end, which is a more technical part. I'll have 20 minutes or so of non-technical and 5 or 10 minutes of more technical, is how we might model that. So this is some of the work we've done at Yale to actually model the club or the coalition modeling, which is actually, turns out to be quite a difficult issue, but I'll show you some old and actually some new results as well. So let me just start with some of the more recent data. So here is, I think, I'll call the most important exhibit in what's happened in international policy, which is the emissions of global emissions. As you can see, they've been rising steadily over the period since 1960 with no break in trend. But perhaps this is more informative. This shows what's called emissions intensity, or the rate of decarbonization. This is the CO2 per unit of global output, global CO2 emissions per unit of global output. And there you can see there's a shaded region on the right and an unshaded on the left. The unshaded region on the left is where there have been no international agreements, and the one on the right is the period after the Kyoto Protocol, where there have been various kinds of international agreements in place. But the key issue is that the trend in decarbonization, there has been decarbonization, but it's been essentially constant plus a random noise at about a little under 2% per year. So what this shows is that up to date, none of the agreements we've had to date have put the kind of dent we need, or the kind of inflection point we need on the rate of decarbonization. Now, where do we stand? So just to summarize the basic point before I get to the further argument. Well, I think the main point is that international climate agreements have not been effective, and that was shown in the last slide. You might say, well, they're in the future, or other reasons to be hopeful, but I think the basic argument is that they have not been. And what are the reasons, and what are the possible solutions? The basic reason, as I'll show in the next couple of slides, is because of the free riding that occurs when you have voluntary agreements for what are called global public goods or externalities. Since we had externalities introduced, we talk about global externalities. Global externalities are the ones that are the most difficult to try to solve. And when we have global externalities without binding agreements with consequences, then we tend to see free riding. So that's the basic reason. And what are the possible solutions? I'd say the most important solution would be to move from the voluntary model to the model with consequences, and that's what I'll be talking about a little later today. So if we think about agreements on global public good, so what's a global public good? It's something where actions we have spill around the entire world, and not only that, but the actions we take are anonymous in the sense that the impacts are independent of whether the emissions are in Milan or in New Haven, Connecticut, or in Beijing. So those are what we mean by international global public goods. Now, what I'm going to do here is talk about, just to put this in the context of, since we are talking about research institutions and universities and science, just to flash up on the slide here some of the important developments that lie behind the kind of work I'm talking about today. And it goes into three classes. The first is interesting. The most important early development of this was cartel theory that was developed after the rise of OPEC. The second class is what I'll call theory, treaty, and the theory of stable coalitions. There's been a great deal of work on that, and some of the most interesting recent work is by Scott Barrett at Columbia. And the final is the theory and estimates for international climate change, and that includes three of the people actually in the room. There may be more, but the three I would particularly like to recognize. One of the earliest and most important pieces was by Carlo Carrera and Domenico Nascaldo on the theory of global public goods in climate. And then there's some of the most important modeling work are by Bossetti, Tavoni, and others using the WICH model, which has been developed over the last, 15 years. So, and then there's other work as well. But all of these are part of the rivers that flow into the kind of issues that I'm talking about today. So there's a deep and rich literature that relates to international agreements. Some of it is well known within our community, others are not well known, but it all points to the same common theme that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so the key issue that we face in any agreement, a multi-party agreement, is to move away from a non-cooperative agreement to a cooperative agreement, from a non-cooperative and inefficient agreement to an efficient agreement. And this usually happens because of free riding. And free riding occurs when someone takes advantage of a common good by not paying a fee. I just was in Paris, and I was just standing waiting for the train, and somebody hopped over the turnstile, and I was too slow to get a picture. I wanted to get a picture of that. So I sat there for 5 minutes waiting for someone else to jump the turnstile. But free riding is something that occurs in many contexts, but the one that gives rise to the term is, of course, free riding on public transportation, where there's not a suitable set of institutions to curtail it. And this syndrome is particularly important in the tragedy of the commons. Many of you know about Hardin's tragedy of the commons, where he actually invokes not the theory, not the game theoretical sources of this, which are in non-cooperative behavior, but more the idea that if you have a common resource, it tends to be overused and overgrazed. And that's because people don't pay for their social costs. So this is seen where you have no agreements at all. Now, there's a particular, so if we think of different communities, nations, cities, families, most agreements can be enforced politically, or at least in principle can be enforced politically. But the structure of international law, which is known as under the laws that were developed after 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, are ones where you cannot legally require countries to participate in agreements they don't want to participate in. So the basic structure of international law is everything has to be voluntary. And so what we're doing is we're coping with that feature of international law, because what we want to do is we want to bring the reluctant people into an international climate agreement, but under international law we can't coerce them to do it. There's no point sending armies in. That's hardly the way to solve the climate problem. So this is the dilemma we're facing. How do you get people to voluntarily cooperate in an agreement for a global public good without coercing them? So let me talk a little about just now go from general global public goods to climate change and climate agreements. So there are two kinds of agreements to begin with. The first one is we have no international agreements, and there you just basically have a non-cooperative equilibrium. That's where everybody just does what's in their own perceived national interest. And the modeling we've done, widespread modeling on this, shows that even if countries did what is optimal from their own point of view, ignoring countries outside them, then that would lead to too small a level of abatement. So that's not surprising. That's basically where we are today. Now, the more surprising result, which is not widely known, is that if you have an agreement, but there are no costs of non-participation, what is the structure of this? So this is where you have countries can form coalitions, and then the coalitions, but they have to be stable coalitions in the sense that countries don't want to leave the coalition. They don't find it advantageous either to leave or to join. And this leads to what is known as the small coalition paradox, which is that you can support coalitions of 2 or 3 countries, but it turns out you can't support larger ones because their tendency to free ride from this takes over, even if they're cooperative, rather non-cooperative agreements. So this is basically where we are with the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accord, and the Paris Agreement. We're just sort of confounded by the small treaty paradox, which is that we can't get people to participate because even in an international agreement, there's this tendency to jump. And this is what caused the unraveling, actually caused the unraveling of the Kyoto Protocol. So this is a slide that shows the unraveling of the Kyoto Protocol, which was subject to free riding. So when the Kyoto Protocol was first negotiated in 1997, this shows you the fraction of emissions, global emissions, that are covered by those countries that had accepted binding. It's not participants, because everyone participated, but those who actually had and agreed to have binding emissions limitations. And as you can see, it started out pretty large, roughly 2/3 at the beginning of 1990, a little more than 50% when it was negotiated. But then it declined, but it also declined with some jumps. And the jumps is when countries left it, the United States being the first arrow, and then the second arrow, which many people don't know about, which is that also Canada left the Kyoto Protocol much the same way the US did, because it couldn't meet its objectives without too high costs because of the oil production. And then by, of course, at the end of 2012, it just basically expired. It just died. So this is an example of free riding at work on an international treaty. And what was the problem with it? There were no consequences if you left. The environmentalists get mad at you, maybe some of your allies get unhappy, but essentially there are no tangible political or economic consequences of leaving that agreement. Okay, so this leads me to the idea of how we could reform or change international climate agreements so as to move from the voluntary agreement model to the model where you have agreements, but there are consequences for non-participation. And so this is what I call a climate club, and it's a club in the sense of an organization. All of us belong to probably different kinds of clubs. We belong to a club that's called a nation, a club that's called a family, maybe some other kinds of clubs. EU is a big club, the WTO is a big club, NATO is a big club, so all these different kinds of clubs. So what we need to do is to figure out how to design a club for an international climate agreement that is effective and has incentives for countries to participate and to meet the agreement. So that's the issue. And the simple answer is you need to have a club where, or an agreement, where non-participants are penalized with some kind of sanction or other kinds of costly action by the members of the agreement. And so this leads to the question, what kinds of penalties can you use? So in the Climate Club, I'm going to talk about it. It's a top-down treaty. It's designed similarly to the post-World War II institutions, not so much like the EU, it's bottom-up, but the World War II institutions, the World Bank, IMF, Bretton Woods, that were top-down treaties. And now in terms of sanctions or penalties, I think both history and law and experience suggest the only viable penalties are trade sanctions. I mean, nothing else has proved to be durable and useful. And then the question is, what kind of trade sanction? And here there are two different possibilities. The one that commonly talked about is countervailing duties, where you put tariff on the carbon content of imports. It turns out that that's an ineffective sanction, and I'll show you some results in a little bit later. And the actual one that I will talk about and is more effective is just a uniform tariff on the imports of non-participants into the participating region. So you have a club with agreement as to what climate policy should be. You have non-participants who are not in the club. The penalty for not being in the club is that your imports into the club region are met with a small uniform tariff. So I'll give you a little bit of the modeling, and the next 10 minutes or so will be a little more technical than the first 10 minutes. So, but I want to talk about, since we're in a research institution, this is another example of the kind of modeling that economists and climatologists and political scientists and game theorists do. And this is an example of what I call a coalition model. I call it the coalition dice model. And it's got a simple structure. It's got 15 different regions, And it's only one period because it turns out it's an extremely complicated combinatorial problem. So it turns out the solution of it is very different. So it's actually quite a simple in principle, but actually quite difficult to solve in practice. And now, so I'll start with this slide, which is kind of a key slide. So let's say you have, I'll use this, I'll explain as I go along. So let's say you have a climate club where you say, we're going to have a policy. The policy is that each participating region or country must have a minimum domestic carbon price of $50 a ton of CO2. So that's the price of admission to the club, so to speak. Those are the dues to be in the club. And you have to have that, and it has to be validated for you to be a bona fide member of the club. So the penalty tariffs are then shown here. This shows the participation rate, the number of participating regions, as the tariff rate goes from 0 to 10%. So you can think of 0% is basically the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Accord. How many countries would participate in that if there were no sanctions for participating? And you can see basically the answer is none. So that basically says the model shows what reality shows is that countries are not going to participate in a strong international climate agreement if there are no consequences. So the second thing is then you see how the number of participating regions rises sharply as the tariff rate increases, and it gets to 15 at about 7% tariff, but it gets to a very high number by the time you got to 3 or 4% uniform tariff rate. So this shows nothing very surprising here, that the number of participants rises as the tariff rate rises. That's because as countries trade off the costs and benefits of participating, it becomes more beneficial to participate because you avoid the tariff losses. And on the other hand, if there are no tariff losses, then there's no reason to participate. So this shows you the same thing, but shows you for different tariff rates, $12, $15, $50, and $100 a ton. And the interesting feature here, which this is one I had not anticipated, is that the effectiveness of it goes up and then down. So it's very effective at a low price, carbon price. You get everybody to participate easily, but it's a low price. You go up a little bit, you get almost everybody to participate. Medium price, a little higher, $50 a ton, you get almost everybody to participate pretty easily. But then as you get a very high carbon price, then the participation rate drops off because countries would rather, it's actually two effects. Countries would rather not participate because it's too costly to have the abatement. But then also you have a participation effect. As one country drops out, the effectiveness declines, and so you kind of shoot to the other equilibrium. Anyway, this is where I ended when I last did this research. So from now on, there's some new things. So what you see here is what I call a carbon tax Laffer curve, which is as the international obligations become stricter and stricter, then basically countries first participate, and the you can think of emissions reductions rise or emissions fall. Let's say emissions reductions rise, the effective global carbon price rises, but then after a point it falls. And so this shows you for 3 different tariff rates how you have this carbon tax Laffer curve, which shows that there's this trade-off, and the trade-off occurs depending on what the carbon tax is at lower, at tariff rate is at lower or higher carbon taxes. But the interesting thing is that you cannot, in this approach, support an extremely high carbon price, carbon tax, with the trade system. So this was one of the places where I left off when I first did this research. Okay, so the original model suggested that you could support a $50 ton carbon tax, but above that it would get very difficult. So anyone who knows this area and has looked at the recent research knows that $50 to $100 a ton is not going to support our ambitious objectives of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, probably not 2.5 degrees C. It's just too low a price. So does this mean that this mechanism is insufficient and it needs to be supported by something else? So that's a question I wanted to ask when I come to talk to my colleagues here. Okay, so what I thought about in preparation for this was, well, that's a one-period model, but it's for 2015. What would happen as we extend it over time? I can't extend the main model because it's too complicated, but you could do a smaller model. And what what the results suggest, and I'll show you in the next two slides, is that the Climate Club can support ambitious targets if you have the Climate Club with some kind of penalty like tariffs, but also only in the presence of rapid technological change. So it has to be not just a binding agreement with penalties for non-participation, but it has to be also rapid technological change that reduces the cost of participation over time. Okay. So what is the reason? You can think of, what I'm going to do is show you a concept, which is called a supportable emissions or carbon price. And by supportable, I mean something that's the break-even for a country between whether to participate or not. So it's the maximum level of carbon price or the maximum level of carbon emissions that one of these international regimes can support. I should say, this is really not only about trade and tariffs, it's really about sanctions and what kinds of sanctions are necessary or penalties are necessary to induce countries to participate. It just is an example of that, but it shows the trade-off. And so I'm just do one equation. I apologize for those, but it just give you the basic result is really simple. The supportable emissions or supportable emissions reduction or supportable carbon price is the point at which the abatement cost exactly equals the cost of the tariffs. So at that point, you're indifferent. If the carbon price is higher than that, then you won't participate because it's cheaper to accept the tariffs. If the carbon price is lower than that, or the emissions are lower than that, then it's more economical to participate. So this gives you the break even between those two. And it's a little bit complicated there, but the key variables there are basically the cost of emissions reductions, the tariff rate, and the cost of tariffs. The other things are, I won't get into. Just it's not a terribly complicated equation. It looks complicated. It's not terribly, but it shows you what the key determinants are as to whether what the break-in level. One interesting result about this is that it turns out that output drops out because it's on both sides of the equation. So it's just the scale variables that are important in determining this. Now this is a function of the key variables that this is determined by are the trends in trade, whether countries are open or not, the decarbonizing technological change, that's the technological change I mentioned before, and the decarbonization rate. So what I did is just, for this purpose, I did 10 regions, equally sized regions. That gives the basic results of the model. And the key policy variable is the R&D, other than the club, is the R&D to support carbon-reducing technological change. So it's decarbonizing technological change, not general carbon, not energy, but decarbonizing technological change. Maybe you can think of in some terminology, reducing the price of the backstop technology. And so I showed you 3 results, one for no technological change, one for 2%, one for 4% per year. And those are quite ambitious, but not outside of historical experience. All right, so the first shows you for the year 2050 what supportable emissions are under each of these. And starting at projection, a baseline of about 50 plus gigatons per year, you can see that if there's no technological change, you'll have some that shows at different tariff rates what the supportable level of emissions are. And if there's no technological change, you can't get down to 0 emissions. But if there's rapid technological change, you can get down to 0 emissions with a relatively low tariff rate. And last slide shows you over time what the supportable emissions look like under the 4 regimes. So this is starting from 2010 and ending in 2060. The baseline is the blue line, and the red, gray, and green lines show you what supportable emissions are with no technological change, modest, and high technological change. So the basic message then, I'll summarize. The first is that the Kyoto Protocol type agreements are ones that will lead to minimal abatement because of free riding. So that's the key, unfortunately pessimistic note that we need, that has been brought by game theorists and treaty specialists and modelers into this discussion. However, strong incentive-compatible agreements are possible if you have these along with penalties, such as trade penalties. And some simple multi-period modeling suggests that you need 2 things, actually. I think it's quite intuitive, but 2 things. You need not only this club-type approach where you have abatement targets plus incentives that work through penalties for non-participation, but you also, if you're going to meet that will get it started, but if you're going to meet the international targets, you need very rapid technological change to reduce the cost of meeting the agreement. Thank you very much.
So I'll start from the questions you've asked, because there were many. And so we want to make sure that we go through most of them. And I'll start from the first, which I also had in mind. When you talk about climate clubs in general, then immediately one starts to think, which countries would you see in the club? And where would the US be, inside or outside the club? And related question is how, I mean, Trump, your president, speaks about tariffs a lot, so would you think he would embrace the idea of this climate club? So the first question is, who do you see or do you imagine in the club, and what's the position of the US with respect to that?
Thank you. Let me start by saying I'm very modest in trying to describe how you develop international agreements. The history of international agreements in every area is one of starts, failures, and then sometimes successes. If you pick any international agreement, whether it's exchange rates, international organizations like the UN, World Health Organization, I could go on and on. Everyone I can think of has been through a period of evolution where something is tried, doesn't work, and you restart. So I want to use this primarily as a conceptual apparatus to think about what the road we're going down is now, the voluntary road, and why that won't work, and what is a model for something that might work. And I don't pretend to be able to design that, but since you asked, I think it's pretty clear what you need is you need the EU, which you already have in a sense. You need the US, which you don't have, and you need China, which you don't have. Now, I think we have to take the long view, not infinitely long view, but we have to look out a decade or so and realize before we do anything, we need to have a conceptual apparatus in the minds of the people who think about this, the climatologists, the economists, the political thinkers, the people who run international organizations, the people who run international environmental research organizations like this one. And this group of people needs to get its thinking as to what the proper direction is. And that's going to take time. These are ideas, after all, the Kyoto Protocol is more than 20 years old. The Framework Convention is 25 years old. We've been going down the path of voluntary agreements at the Framework Convention in 1994. So if, in fact, these ideas have some validity, it's going to take us as researchers and as implementers to think our way through these. So that'll take at least 2 years. So then at that point, perhaps the policy landscape will be changed. I do think that in the United States that you have the White House and then the rest of the world. And so I think that, unfortunately the White House is in charge, but the rest of the world will be in charge, and the rest of the United States will be in charge sooner or later, within 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. And there's been a great evolution in the United States, both among the political leaders and the public as to the view of climate change. So I think we, as a society, the United States is very much in step. The leaders and thinkers in universities and research groups, in RFF as an example, with the thinking here in Europe. I know the politics is lagging behind, but I think we just have to be patient. But I think before we do anything, we need to get our own thinking clear as to how to proceed.
So some people ask whether, can we imagine the idea of tariffs somehow linked to the Paris Agreement, to save the Paris Agreement, because it's there. So to start something completely new, do you imagine something that starts within the WTO, so somewhere else, or could you imagine that through tariffs we can somehow save something of the Paris Agreement?
I will speculate. I'm an economist, not a diplomat or international relations specialist, but it does seem. I remember in 1998 and 1999, when there were criticisms of the Kyoto Protocol, the answer was, well, it's just the first step, and it will evolve. Well, it actually didn't. So I do think that sometimes you need I hate the word paradigm shift, but you probably need a paradigm shift, it's a shift in thinking, but it might also have to be a shift in the decision locus. I think it's extremely difficult to conceive of this coming out of the current negotiating framework.
So somebody else asked about inequality. So will the idea of climate clubs effectively affect more and penalize poorer countries more? So.
Well, the whole, in a way, it goes back to the slide that Max showed about the impact of climate change. And if I looked at that, and I think, Max, you said this explicitly, the largest impacts of climate change will be on the poorer regions of the world. So in a sense, climate policy by itself is something that's pro-equality in the sense that it's helping countries that are in the poorer part of the distribution now. Now, how you implement it, what kinds of particular inducements there would be or subsidies for low and middle income countries, that could be part of it. There's no reason why you couldn't have transfers to countries that participate. But I think the main thing is that we have to get across the idea that it's countries that participate. Countries need to have incentives for themselves to participate to make it work.
So you discussed about R&D and the role of technical change and lowering the cost of decarbonizing technologies. So do you imagine a link between the tariffs and the investment or subsidies to R&D as a way of actually getting more R&D done? Or do you have a version of the model that has some, in some sense, endogenous technical change, or did you just look into it through exogenous scenarios of different rates of technical change?
Well, the point of the tariffs is like the point of an army. You don't want to use them. And the most successful agreement would be one where people participate, or virtually all countries participate, and so there basically are no tariffs. So that's the purpose of it. The purpose of it isn't to have tariff wars around the world. It's basically to give countries incentives to participate. I think it does raise the question, the important question though is, how is this rapid technological change going to occur? Well, I think one of the important points that's been shown in the research that has been done is shown in the WICH model, has been shown by scholars in this area, is the important role of high carbon prices in inducing technological change. So in terms of carbon-saving technological change, probably the most important single policy would be to have a high carbon price, because that would give incentives to companies to put their R&D dollars into carbon-reducing technological change instead of coal-fired electricity, into renewable electricity, and into other kinds of low-carbon technologies. So that's the most important, the absolutely most important step is induced technological change. And then as to how much subsidies and what kinds of subsidies, intellectual property rights and so on, that's a third step.
So I have a question related to something that is more concerned with the center and your research in a broader sense than what you showed us here, which is when you've done a lot of research that was really connecting very different disciplines. That's kind of uncommon. It's uncommon because we tend to specialize a lot, and less we find common language or share space with other disciplines. And so my question to you is, why did you decide to do it? And was it hard? You have here a lot of students. Some of them, I believe, are from Politecnico. Some of them are economists from Bocconi. So when and how did you decide that you would try to talk to other people from other disciplines, scholars from other disciplines?
So that's a really interesting question, important question. So I think of the life cycle of a scholar, particularly even one, whether it's disciplinary or interdisciplinary, as one where you spend your college years deciding what you're interested in. You might be studying Pascal, you might be studying Machiavelli, you might be studying Dante, you surely be studying mathematics and statistics, and then you decide, okay, I want to do economics, I want to do climate science, I want to do ecology. So then you spend the next 10 years of your life becoming a specialized and competent scientist in your area. Become someone who knows the tools of economics and knows how to use them, or someone who knows the tools of statistics and how to use them. So at that point, many scholars go through this period in their very early part of their lives where they work in their own home discipline very, very intensively, and they have a grounding, so they know what the scientific method is, they know what good scholarship is, they know what bad scholarship is, they know how to recognize something that's poor scholarship, and they learn to do it themselves, and they learn how hard it is, and they learn how wonderful and how fun it is, and they learn how you meet colleagues in your area and how you work together. So that's something. It's like it's not a formal schooling, but it's a very important part of professional life, and it takes years. It takes 5 or 10 years to actually become so you are a really serious scholar in your own area. Now at that point, some people just do that the rest of their lives, and other people get interested in a particular problem. so they might be interested in financial economics, so they need to study that. Or they might be interested in central banking, so they study central banking. Or they might be interested in behavioral economics, so they go study psychology. Or in our case, you might be interested in environmental economics, and then you need to learn about the specialized area that you're interacting with. So you need, in climate change economics, you need to learn the elements of climatology, of atmospheric chemistry, of energy systems, of impacts. But one of the things that I always remind myself whenever I'm in front of, well, in any place, is that I'm not a professional climatologist. I'm not a professional ecologist. And I'm just I'm like a student in class that I listen to people and I absorb it, but that's not my expertise. To the extent I have any, it's in the economics and the disciplines that are related to economics. But there is this life cycle, and so and it's dependent on where you are, as we talked about earlier. In some places it's easier to do. It's easier to do in a research institute like this, where you have people in different places. I first developed my own interest in climate science / economics when I was at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, and I just happened to be sharing an office with a climatologist, and then I had someone who was a technologist next door, and someone who was a mathematician and a probabilist down the hall. So it happened that this was a very fruitful place, as this institute will be, or as RFF will, or as many universities are, where you have colleagues that you can interact with or you will bump into. But I think it is a natural sequence as you become interested in a particular area that you will grow, reach out to the people. But the one thing I would really emphasize is the need to have your very, very solid grounding in your own field, not just because it's good to have your own field, but because it teaches the methodology of science, the methodology of investigation, the methodology of testing, the methodology of using statistics, if that's in your field. And that's a necessary component of being a good interdisciplinary researcher, is to have a solid field that you work from, but then you can reach out to other people in other fields who are similarly have solid grounding in their fields.
Now imagine you have a PhD student just starting their PhD, and they really want to, at some point, to contribute to the problem of climate change. They are economists. What problem would you suggest they should look into? What is the next big problem besides, the international agreement?
Well, I would first say that you need to work in an area that's your comparative advantage, where you have talent, and where you have interest. And all of those are really important. You can't work in a field if you don't have the talent and the expertise, but you won't last in a field if it's not interesting to you, if you don't find that spending many, many, many long nights and long days and long weekends and vacations worrying about the particular problem that you're interested in. If you're not interested in it, then it's not for you. So my experience is most people are interested in a particular niche of the climate change problem. I'd say the ones that I think are particularly ripe for research. I've talked about one today. There's lots of room there. I think one area that's particularly poorly understood is the impacts of climate change. It's poorly understood, but it's also extremely difficult. We have good understanding of the impacts of climate change on agriculture. I mean, we know about the climate impacts, but I'm talking about the impacts on human and natural systems. We have pretty good understanding of agriculture. We have a pretty good understanding of the impacts of sea level rise, and that's about it. I'd say outside that, for example, I'll give some examples where we don't know much. one of my teachers said, the problem is not what we don't know, it's that so much that we know is wrong. And I think similarly, I think there's a lot we know about impacts, I won't say it's wrong, but is not securely studied. So here's some examples. Migration and climate change. Migration is a very complicated issue. It's not only an impact of climate change, it's also a safety valve in the sense that people can move, say, within a country from regions that are becoming less habitable or less productive, relatively less productive, to ones that are more productive. So migration has many, many sides of it. In developing countries and rich countries, Europe and North America, it has one feature, which is people who may not like immigration, but for the countries that are sending it, or the countries that are troubled, it's a completely different face. A similar and related area is conflict. What is the relationship between climate change and conflict, say military conflict? That's something that has not been well studied. A third area is health, particularly public health. I mean, we know some of the challenges there, but there are different schools of that depending on the role of adaptation and public health and advances in medicine. I'll just give you one example there. If you look deeply into some of the impact studies, many of them have one of the most damaging impacts of climate change being the spread of malarial mosquitoes. And indeed, if malarial mosquitoes spread more widely and there are no changes in medical technology, then that would be a serious human problem. But then if you ask on the other side, what if there is an effective malaria vaccine, an inexpensive malaria vaccine, then it completely changes the equation. So it's not just impacts, but also adaptations that are a critical part of that. So I would say this is a second area. And then I do think another one that I think is particularly interesting is so what I call these what are called the catastrophic impacts. And these are things like the North Atlantic circulation, the giant ice sheets, monsoonal patterns, and so on. One that I've been particularly interested in is the role of climate change on the giant ice sheets. I've studied Greenland, and I think Antarctica is another one, particularly the West Antarctic ice sheet is another one. So these are, I mean, if you're interested in glaciology, then this is a great place to study. If you're interested in public health, that's an important one. So you need to somehow, it needs to be a marriage of your interests, your talents, with the problem, because there's a wide range of issues in climate change that could benefit from active research.
So the last question to you, and it's the toughest, and I haven't made it up. It was there, written, asked by some people, and that is, what do you say to your grandchildren about climate change? I mean, do you feel satisfied with what your generation has accomplished in terms of starting to solve the problem?
What do I say to my grandchildren? Well, they are 9 years old and 12 years old. I think they're very interested in the issue. So they're trying to understand what it really means. So I think one of the things that is the most interesting thing is our children learn about climate, even, let's say, all of us who are scientists, economists, ecologists, whatever you are, modelers, our children, your children, learn about climate change in schools. They learn 10 times as much about it in schools as they do at home. So the question is, what does the curriculum at school look like? And we know a little bit about that answer. In some parts of the world, there is no curriculum on climate change. In other parts, it's a kind of straw man, and it's a kind of caricature of good science. So I'll come back to your question, but I do think that I would add this as another important area of research. I think we need to think carefully about how we communicate climate change impacts, mitigation, costs, carbon pricing, clubs, whatever it is, to not just to the broader citizens and to our students, those of us who teach in universities, to our and how it is taught in our schools as well as in our children, to our children, because that is really the front line. It's the children, not just the children that are marching, but our students. My view is, well, I'll just say, we had a recent reception in the U.S. Capitol for Nobel Prize winners, and so I had a chance at that to talk to many members of Congress, and it's clear to me, and these are many of them very concerned about climate change, it's clear to me that our college students have a much clearer understanding of causes and solutions than many of our political figures, because the way they get their information is so distorted. So I think the answer, I think I'm answering a little different question, because my children are still pretty, my grandchildren are at the pretty young age, but I do think one of our important objectives is to think very carefully about the channels of communication, not just talking to the press or to the television, but actually more fundamentally, how it is taught in our schools. What do the textbooks look like that people use in schools? What are the materials? I'll just finish on one point here. This point had been particularly taken up by the biologists in the teaching of evolution. So it's probably not a big issue in Milan, but it is in the United States, where the teaching of evolution has become very controversial and very politicized. So what the biologists did was create curricula for school children that explain in a scientific, careful way for 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 16-year-olds, what evolution is, what the evidence is, and how we understand it. I think we in our community would be, I think we'd be well served by using that as a kind of model for one of the other activities that we undertake.
Okay, with this, I want to thank you. We've squeezed you like a lemon, so thank you so much. So we're going to have a panel discussion in a few minutes, but before that we have a little surprise. And the reason for the surprise is the following. Everyone who's done science knows that it's not just following your rational thoughts that you find the solution to your problem. Sometimes finding a solution to your problems is kind of something that happens in the shower when you're listening to music. It just happens. And to all of you who are not scientists, more broadly, you can, I believe, feel the fact that we cannot solve the problem of climate change by simply using the science. We're going to need to use other tools as well. So this is a gift to you from two researchers of the European Institute on Economics and the Environment, Johanna Semmerling, that is going to come and play the piano, and Maria Esther Calcinelli, who's going to read a poem by Jim Morrison. The music, though, is from Einaudi, who's an Italian composer. So even here, we want to put together the US and Italy. So please join me to thank them for coming on stage.
I am the woman in the window. I am the woman. See the children playing. Soldier, sailor, young man, on your way to the summer swimming pool. Man, you are evil. Get out of my garden. Ours is a good place, home of the reindeer. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Laughing. Come upstairs or to your room, and I will play for you. Oh, dreamland, golden Cineland, try to sleep land, dreamland, dreamland, take us to dreamland. Sell me your pony, your fast golden pony. I need strength. and his terrible footsteps. Open your window, woman of Palestine, and cover us. Hover. Throw down your raiment and cover us. Hover. 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 And cover us. Hover.
I can speak loud. So I'll introduce Carlo Carraro, who is going to chair the panel. I introduce Carlo the following way. Carlo is the godfather of our institute. He is, he's the one who really helped us. And so please welcome on stage, Carlo. Thank you.
Good afternoon. We're going to start the panel in a few seconds. We need a time to go back to the screen. We need a screen for the first speech, so we need to wait for a few seconds. So let me thank again both Richard Newell and Antonia Navarra, the president of RFF-CMCC, for the vision they show when they decided to support the creation of this institute, European Institute for the Economics of the Environment. As many of you know, 30 years ago, I created with Domenico Siniscalco FEEM, and FEEM became very successful. In a few years, became one of the top, one of the leading centers in the economics of the environment, probably because the field was open. I mean, they were just the beginner, the first ones to enter in this field. And I'd like to use these few minutes to thank, there are many of those that have been working for FEEM for these 30 years who are here in the room. I would like to thank all of them for the success of FEEM, what they did during these years. 2 years ago, FEEM was destroyed, and most of them, most of the researchers, all of those were working in Venice moved into CMCC and then to the European Institute of Economics and Environment. 6 months later, the ones working, most of those working in Milan, moved into the European Center for Economics and Environment and CMCC. So we are back all together, and we are starting today a new adventure, my last one, but the first one for many of you. And I'm quite glad to be here, probably not as a godfather. I think that Bill is a much better godfather than what I can. Bill is great. And I can just help you in this transition. I mean, transition is over. You have all the strength and talent to start a new successful research institute. But let's move to the panel. Now we have the screen back. It's a nice one. We have 4 speakers. One is missing, Ottmar Edenhofer, who is professor in Germany at PEAK. Today had a meeting with Angela Merkel, and he could not come here. And that meeting is another interesting example of how weak is our country with respect to these issues. When Angela Merkel wants to learn something and to design climate policy, this is what she did today. She goes to talk with scientists and ask their own advice of what she can do to solve this problem. This never happens and never happened in Italy, of course, but at least among us, we can start talking, and the community is big. It's not just a community of scientists, it's a community of policymakers, it's a community of business leaders who understand the importance of this issue for the future of humanity. And they are here today. Some of them are here today to testify their own commitment to solve this problem. So let me introduce the 4 panelists. The first one is a very famous policymaker, Joost Delbeke. Joost Delbeke, please come here. He has been the general director of DG Climate, the division of the European Commission in charge of climate policy. And he has been for many years a very successful general director because the achievements, and we will talk about these achievements of Europe in this field, are his own, the outcome of his own efforts. And he just finished and is now working at the European University Institute in Florence. He's collaborating with the Association of Environmental Economists as the chair of the Policy Outreach Committee and many other activities, because Jos cannot do just one thing, only does 10 at least at times. So thank you Jos, for being here. The second speaker comes from the world of industry, Stefano Venier, who is the CEO of Hera, the most important utility company in Italy. The third speaker coming from the business world is Karina Lüdwak. Thank you, Karina, for being here. She's in the board of Eni in Italy, but she's she's an expert of energy and climate, and she's advising many companies in Europe. And finally, science and academia are also represented here, and they're represented at the top level by the rector of Bocconi University, Gianmaio Verona. Thank you for being here. Thank you. And I believe that the discussion among us will certainly help understanding not just the problem, but the solution. Bill already told us many nice things about how to address, how to solve the problem, but then the practical implementation, the day-by-day implementation, is another matter. And I would like to start with Jos. Jos has a short presentation that shows what Europe's been doing in the last 20 years and the achievements of Europe. So please, Jos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlo, and thank you for a very exciting day and a very exciting start of the new institute. I wish you all the best of luck, because we need those institutes also working together across the Atlantic and joining up for research. So it's a real pleasure to be here. What I would like to do is add a few words of what we have been doing in Europe, and also having some words on the expose that we just had from Professor Nordhaus. And this is basically what we have been doing in Europe since 1990, and that is the beginning of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we started the worldwide counting there. And you see the historic emissions did not show very much. We reduced our emissions a little bit between 1990 and 2005, let's say with 0.5% per year. That was the unification of Europe when new member states started and a lot of energy efficiency improvements could be made. It really started in 2005, and that is what I would like to say to Professor Nordhaus. the Kyoto Protocol was very important for Europe to get started. So thanks to the Kyoto Protocol, we started with our own policies implementing in Europe, and we decreased between now and between 2005 and 2017 our emissions in Europe, not with 0.5%, what we did before, but with 1.5%. And our leaders, the heads of state and government of Europe, have decided by 2030, we will do 40% reduction. That means that the 1.5 annual emission reduction will be increased to approximately 2%. And we will do that without corrections at the border. But then you look at 2030, then we will have to reduce our emissions in order to become climate neutral. That is what we said we would do under the Paris Agreement. And so the annual emission reductions will have to increase from 2% per year to approximately 4% per year. And that is going to be a major challenge. And I think that the idea of trade corrections and a carbon club may well appear in that period, because it is a wake-up call to not only how we produce energy, but also how we are going to produce industrial commodities such as steel and chemicals and cement, which are very carbon intensive. So to cut a long story short, Europe started in a climate policy without trade corrections. You could say we were picking in the low-hanging fruit, but as of 2030, the fruit may become more expensive, and so the trade question may come up. But the key of this, and I think thanks to the work of William Nordhaus, the key of the work was the contribution that economists made to the thing, and the major contribution was to have carbon pricing. And we started with carbon pricing in Europe in 2005, and we are latest figures 2018, and we reduced our emissions with those companies covered by the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme, with almost 30%. That is quite significant, and that came through the introduction of a carbon price to put a price on carbon. That was the strong message I think we learned from our American friends at the time. And here you see how, quantitatively speaking, the emissions reduced, and those emissions covered by the ETS is approximately less than half of the emissions of Europe. But we had a carbon price that was installed to a cap and trade system, and that carbon price, as you see, was fluctuating quite a bit. When we started, we had carbon prices in the range of 15 to 25 euros, and today we are again at that price level. We had lots of debate following the Lehman Brothers crisis, when the carbon prices and economic activity went down, whether the prices of around 5 euros per ton were really meaningful. Despite that, we reduced our emissions, which is the most important, but we redressed the balance on the market, and today we have again carbon prices, and today the price was 25.5 euros for a ton of carbon dioxide emitted. So every day we have an exchange on the market, and I think that is thanks to the lessons that the economists were teaching to the policymakers, that you do not reduce carbon if it is not in the self-interest of the economic operators, and a carbon tax is doing the job, but a carbon price has been doing the job for our industries. Behind all that in Europe, and that is a very important graph, is that the gray line goes up. That means that our GDP has been going up with some 53%, while at the same time our greenhouse gas emissions have been going down with 23%. That means that we have been able to decouple in Europe the emissions from economic development. Per unit of CO2, per unit of GDP, we halve the CO2 content, and I think that's a major achievement. Some may say it has been easy for Europe because you import a lot of stuff from China and other places, which is true, but our import figures have not gone down. our export figures kept going up for chemicals and other industrial commodities. So if you make a correction, then we can still uphold the fact that Europe has been able to decouple its emissions. Now, where has that happened? And I would like to guide you to the last three columns. That is that basically we reduced our emissions in the energy sector and in the industrial, in the manufacturing sector. And where it is not going well is in the transport sector, where emissions have been going up. And today emissions are, compared to 1990, approximately 20% higher compared to where we have in the energy and industry sector figures that are 30 to 40% lower. So that is a major wake-up call that Europe in its next phase will have to address the transport emissions. That is a wake-up call in particular to member states, because transport emissions are not regulated through the emissions trading system. So if we would like to handle and tackle the problem, we will either have to do it to proper price incentives, but that will have to happen not at European level, but at national level. And that is a major task that all member states, in particular also member states like Italy, face up to. I think, and that's not only for Italy, that's for Germany, that's for the Benelux, that's for France, for the UK, a very difficult issue that will have to be tackled. I will limit my comments there. I would like to conclude in saying that the European experience has been that putting a price on carbon has paid off. It stimulated technology and innovation, and it stimulated the number of patents that were currently introduced by our companies to have low carbon innovation maintained for the future. At the same time, we know that when the marginal cost of abatement is going to go up, that the trade disputes are going to intensify. And that is what I took from the very useful intervention of William Nordhaus today about the carbon clubs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. I have a question. I think it's important to let the audience know of the important change that took place last year. For many years, the carbon price, the ETS price, has been very, very low. And it is true that Europe was the only one to have this kind of mechanism, and it was very positive. Europe was leading all countries in the world, but the price was too low. €5 per ton of carbon was really insufficient to induce any kind of change, any kind of technological innovation, and so on and so forth. By the way, the issue of technological innovation, as Bill said, is really very, very important if you want to effectively address climate change. What happened? Suddenly, the price went from 5 to 25. What happened?
Well, we had to repair the market because of the Lehman Brothers crisis. There was a decline in energy production, a decline in industrial production. So there was a surplus of allowances in the market. And that surplus of allowances, given the demand, had to be taken out of the market. Now, that means a strengthening of the target. And we had in Europe no majority to strengthen the target. So how did we do it in the end? And that was the secret before you see mid-2017 prices going up. We created a market stability reserve, which is a kind of fridge where you take the surplus out of the market, you put it in the fridge, and if it is for more than 3-4 years in the fridge, you cancel them. So it's a typical compromise between not strengthening the target, but at the same time taking out of the market the surplus that was killing the price signal. And that is what has been done in the review of the legislation in 2018.
But don't you think we need an independent authority to regulate the market rather than giving the parliament this role? I mean, like the central bank regulates the money market, why don't we need something similar for the emission market?
Because that discretionary power is not easily be given to a supranational authority. And I think that was also the theme that William Nordhaus was bringing up, That is that in the beginning of the carbon market, the member states wanted to maintain all power with them. And so in the first 3 years, as you can see on the slide, between 2005 and 2008, there was a massive over-allocation and the prices went to zero. And the consequence has been that the member states realized they could not continue like that, and they surrendered that power to the European Commission. And in 2008, we started anew, but changing the level of ambition in the midst of the economic recession, because Lehman Brothers means economic recession, and economists would say it is normal in times of recession that the price of carbon goes down, and in times of economic prosperity that the prices is going up. But the range was quite radical. Indeed, prices were falling below 10 euros per ton, and that was clearly too much. But still, in Europe is a democracy. You have to create a majority before you can change things and address things, and it took us longer than we in this room would like. But when you are in the European institutions, in the European Parliament, in the European Council, it needs a lot of convincing to have a qualified majority, where also some member states who are heavily relying, for example, on coal and on coal-fired power station to get their agreement to do this thing. But in the end, we got the agreement, and let's look forward. The previous slide showed that despite these low prices, the emissions went down. So the emissions did not go up because of the low prices. The emissions kept going down. In fact, it's an issue for more economic analysis, why it was that once we had a carbon market installed, that prices relatively stable were diminished, or the emissions were diminished every year, year by year, not in direct relationship to the price.
Yeah, the 25 euro price, today's price, is certainly a much better incentive, but also a much better source of revenue. But we can talk about how to use that revenue later. Let's talk about the industry. What Jos showed us is that industry and the power sector and the industrial sector were the ones who were able to reduce emission more than the other ones. From your viewpoint, what are the reasons of this success, and what's next? What are the next steps that industries, and from a technological viewpoint or from a strategic viewpoint, should implement in the coming years?
Okay, thank you, and good evening also from myself. Well, I think just to reply to the first question, that is about why the energy industry has been so successful with respect to the other industries. I think that the large part of the incentives or the trigger came from the incentives. I mean, this industry has been heavily incentivized to, let's say, invest in renewables. And also part of the effect, as was said at the beginning, after the Lehman Brothers event, crisis was related to the fact that we had a strong decline in industry demand, and therefore, as a consequence, the energy industry could be, or could show to be more, let's say, valuable or more advanced in the progress of reducing CO2. What I think opening or enlarging the perspective is the fact that we need to look wider. I mean, energy is of course one sector, but if I take the example of my company is engaged basically in three major areas: energy, but also water and resources management. And I think we need to look in a different way also to the other two aspects. We have been trying to do that. I mean, we focus the perspective of the company on three major purposes, embracing some of the targets that COP21 set and also the SDGs set. And the three major purposes are: promote intelligent use of energy, that means promote decarbonization, promote energy efficiency, that is core competence and core area in where we are focusing on. On the other side, also enable efficient use of resources. I think we can't survive with an Earth Overshoot Day that stands the 2nd of August, and with Europe standing in some day in May. We need to tackle also that part of, let's say, the perspective to reach a sustainable position that is not only related to CO2 emissions, but in general, a balancing between resources generated and resources used by the companies. And to do that, what we have done is to try to promote the implementation of what is well known that is a circular economy, but practically speaking, implementing the 3 R's, that is reuse, reduce, recycle, recover, and regenerate. And that is not something that is strictly applied to waste management, as large part of the people think. It's something that can be applied throughout the different sectors, water management, for instance, but all the other materials management we have, and energy, of course. I think that is the major area. If you think that a company like us collects 4 million tons of waste every year, of course, the theme of recycling or the theme of recovering is key, is fundamental. It's fundamental to, let's say, drive toward a more balanced situation between use and try to make evolving the, let's say, consumption model that we have applied so far that is linked to the GDP growth that used to be the sole driver. So take, use, and dispose toward a model that is more concentrated on circular economy. But on the other side also we need to work a lot also in engaging people. Engaging and making people more aware. When we talk to young people or to our customers, we have clear perception that they don't realize yet very well what is the battle we are playing. And work in trying to make these people more aware about how they can contribute to reusing the material or how they can contribute in reducing their consumption, of course, can make the difference. We are not working for them, we need to work with them. And in that we have made, and we are doing several interesting experiences. One is in energy efficiency, that now that is like the one that Tavoni showed at the beginning, in communicating the people how they are working out, the way they are consuming the energy, but we are also thinking in extending this kind of message, this kind of nudging, also including water consumption and waste management. So to give them the full spectrum of information, to make them to understand, to make them their own, let's say, environmental balance, their own family environmental balance. And I think it is extremely important to work in that direction, because if we focus only on supply side, I mean, we are dealing with one part of the problem. We need to be also on the other part of the problem, that is demand management.
Yeah, and talking about the two sides of the problem, we've been talking today a lot about mitigation, emission reduction, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but just a little bit, almost nothing about adaptation. I mean, how to address the impacts of climate change, because we are going to have climate change anyway. Whatever we're going to do in terms of emission reduction, some climate change arrive. I mean, at least 1 additional degree of temperature increase will arrive. What is your company doing in terms of adaptation of future climate change? I mean, you are dealing with water, waste, resource management. What are you doing?
We have, of course, the two sides of the coin. On one side, we have to deal with procuring or saving the availability of water, for instance. And on the other side, we have huge problems to maintain the business continuity. I mean, my company, or the company I'm running, is a service company. And the core, let's say, the core value is the reputation. And reputation is built on guaranteeing the service in any condition. So what we are working now is to define and to prepare the company to deal with these changes in a much longer time. Okay. The limit we have had so far in planning in the companies was to look at 5 years plan, 6 years plan, typically or more recently 3 years plan. But if you take that kind of perspective, you can identify the solutions for this kind of trends that requires interventions that need a much longer perspective and also need to understand how the different scenarios interact to each other. So having said that part of, let's say, context, what we are working on is to create a condition to regenerate as much as possible the water available on one side, and on the other side, to enhance the quality of the infrastructure to be much more resilient. Okay, and the way we do it is twofold. The first, of course, using the IoT to collect information and to understand how the different assets are working under stressing conditions, so to make them, to maintain the consistency, to maintain the continuity in the service. And on the other side, we are creating those infrastructure that could help us also to preserve the resources. I can make you an example. We are now building, or we are now finalizing a project in the coast of Rimini, that is, under the Adriatic Sea, and in there we are building an infrastructure that not only will manage more properly the possible floods in that part of territory, but we are also building large and huge storages to collect the rainfalls. And through the collection of the rainfalls, we can, on one side, manage then the outflows more properly and to preserve eventually part of that water for future uses.
Thank you. Karina.
Thank you very much.
You're probably one of the best observers of what is going on in Europe in the field of energy and climate, what the business world is doing in this field. So what's your assessment of the situation and what your vision for the future? What should the business world do to get things better than what they are? We know that emission reduction are largely insufficient. What can we do to do more?
Thank you for the question, because I think we've heard some very encouraging news from you and some very exciting news from you, but the picture is actually very, very depressing. And I, from speaking for myself, I lose a lot of sleep over this. Let me just start by saying that although I serve on the board of Eni, the Italian oil and gas company, I am non-executive, so I am not authorized to speak for the company, and there probably is someone in the room here who is. So if you have questions for Eni, do find them and talk to them. I'm going to speak to you today about my personal views, but also about what I see increasingly business leaders doing to address this problem, because we've approached this today from the standpoint of optimizing public policy, which is absolutely critical to business doing what it needs to do. We heard from Professor Nordhaus that unless those externalities and the free rider problem are not addressed effectively, there is going to continue to be perverse behavior, and we are going to continue to emit far more than this planet can sustain. And quite apart from the fact that there are some massive environmental and social consequences, it's also bad for business, and that may seem like a very secondary consideration, but for those of us like myself who serve on the boards of directors of companies who have a legal obligation to deliver results and to demonstrate that we are doing the right thing for our shareholders and our stakeholders, these present some very, very thorny challenges. So to answer your question, Professor Carraro, and by the way, I was very, very privileged to have Professor Carraro come and speak to train our board. And this, to me, is exemplary of exactly what boards need to be doing. As many of you know, I tend to speak more to business audiences than this kind of audience, I think. Companies are run by executives, but sitting perched at the top are a bunch of supposedly very intelligent people who have a lot of power to make decisions about the direction that the company is going to take. They don't run the company, but they supervise, they approve, they challenge, and at the end of the day, they're the ones who are legally responsible if things go wrong. And it happens that the people who are chosen to carry out these extremely important functions are not chosen for their knowledge of the implications of climate change. None of them are. It never happens. People are chosen because they're brilliant at finance, they're brilliant at strategy, they've been brilliant CEOs in the past. Some of them have digital technology skills, some of them have change management skills, any number of skills. They're all very smart people, usually. They don't know what climate change means for their companies. Now, if you accept, as we all do in this room, that climate change is the single greatest challenge facing humanity, and therefore business needs to sort of grab the reins and do something about this, and do something that lies outside the ordinary role of business in the past. It's not so much following the rules and staying out of trouble and maximizing financial results. It's really about looking beyond and looking at overcoming those externalities that we heard about just now. And the ability to synthesize these concepts, to hear what Professor Corrao spent 3 hours training my board to do, and then to know what to do with it, is actually really difficult. Because let me just tell you something. You did a fantastic job when you came and spoke to us. I've recommended to everybody I know that you go and do this to other boards. But the moment you walked out the room, we all looked at each other and said, so what do we do with that? How do we interpret this information? How do we interpret this information on the macroeconomics and the science of climate change and actually incorporate it into the decisions that we are called upon to make every month? And I'll just tell you a couple of secrets. We are called upon to approve CapEx proposals. CapEx proposals take into account our projections on the carbon price. In the industry where I happen to serve, the carbon price is immaterial. It's very material for the energy generation business, and it's put some energy companies out of business, or close to it. But in the oil and gas business, the fluctuations of the oil price by far and away, dwarf the impact of the carbon price. So if we want, there's no mystery. Why is the production of fossil fuels continuing to climb? Because we can absorb the impact of the cost of carbon. Demand is continuing to increase, and there is no painful bite on costs and therefore on consumer demand for that product. Technology, we all hope, is going to displace the conventional fuels, but that is not happening yet, and the projections, notwithstanding even quite bullish assumptions about the progress of technology, are that demand is going to continue to be very positive straight through until 2040. So we are not seeing the changes that would prompt companies to reinvent their business models in the way that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change would suggest that they do. And so, to answer your original question, what should we do? My view, and this is something I've actually done something about, is to bring together directors who sit in that position of influencing the decision-making to educate themselves about climate change and to mobilize experts. And I think it was you, Professor Nordhaus, who was saying earlier that people are very good at their field, but they need to work with people in other fields and develop interdisciplinary approaches to solving problems. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In my day-to-day functions as a board director, we have to oversee the integrated risk management systems, right? We have a model that maps risks over a 4-year period, and we have on the x-axis, we have probability of, no, we have on the y-axis, we have probability of occurrence, and on the x-axis, we have impact, and so it's x times y, and you have all these quadrants, and try to find a climate impact in a 4-year model that is going to have any kind of material impact on the business. You won't. So the models that are used today, and I would suggest probably that in the insurance industry they're a lot smarter than we are, but generally speaking, the models that are employed do not capture the climate risk in its full complexity. It does not capture the horizon, it doesn't capture the interdependencies, the feedback loops, the systemic impacts that is missing from a key tool that businesses use to then inform their strategic planning. So if you don't have the appropriate tools, if an oncologist is using an MRI machine that doesn't work, you're not going to get the proper diagnosis and you're not going to make the right decisions. So this is one of many, many areas where businesses and board directors who are charged with supervising them need to develop a much deeper understanding of what they can do bring about the creation of new tools so that they can do a better job, do their jobs differently from what brought us to the situation we are in today, and hopefully play a part in driving this quite radical transformation that the global economy is going to need to experience.
Thank you, Karina. And I want to talk a bit about finance. This is a question for both of you, but I would like to ask Gianmario the question first. Massimo Tavoni showed a slide before in which the size of the investments that are necessary for the transition to a climate resilient world, a world in which emissions are compatible with the survival of our society in this planet, are the size of the investment which is necessary. And it's a huge size. Indeed, one of the paradoxes of climate change is that the cost of reducing emission is really low. It's a tiny fraction of GDP per year, but the investment cost is huge. So at the end, it's a financial issue. It's not an economic one, it's really a financial one. So what finance is doing, and what's the perception of finance of the problem?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me, and congratulations for this beautiful institution, using the words of Dr. Nordhaus, and thanks again, Dr. Nordhaus, for a fantastic presentation before. Well, I think that the finance is the complementary side of economics in this respect. We have seen how economics can model the behaviors, but then finance is about, right, the resources that we can pull into action. And we are clearly living a moment of disruption. A moment of disruption that in the theory of innovation, typically we tend to distinguish two broad types of waves of innovation, those that are technology push and those that are demand pull. And I would say that this one is clearly demand pull, because if we waited for the industries, probably we would have had many more years with the current technologies that would have destroyed the world. So clearly we are doing this because there is a strong call to action by demand, by consumers, by society as a whole. And finance, I would say, on the one hand, finance is doing something interesting because it's promoting investments in this direction. I would like to make an exemplification of something extraordinary in my view, because the CEO and founder of BlackRock, Larry Fink, has written this fantastic letter to the CEOs, which he usually writes on January every single year. And is calling to action about what he calls purpose. And at the end, purpose is about the things that we talked about this afternoon. It's broader, but it's about the things we talked about this afternoon. So it's about the investment, which in finance we call basically ESG, so environment, sustainability, corporate government investments. And so the good news is that the finance world is going towards behaviors that are consistent with this massive investment which we have to make. And it's doing that even because, as I said before, there is a demand which is looking for this. One of the points made by Larry Fink in the letter was that at the end, most of the multinationals are selling products and services to millennials and to centennials, and these are the guys that clearly want a better world, right? To not talk about the alpha generation, those were born after 2010. So clearly finance is working in the direction of trying to promote this type of investment. But the point is that there is also let's say, the problem, the complexity also of the consequences of some of these investments. Because, for example, speaking about finance, most of the pension funds have still strong investments in companies that have strong fossil fuels, of course, initiatives. And so, of course, it's very important that we develop models that are consistent to produce, let's say, a coherent and, let's say, sort of evolutionary adaptation to this changing market. But the problem, as you said, is that the investment is massive and the payoff, of course, in the short run is limited. So again, something which has been mentioned by the last two panelists, clearly it's important, the call to action in terms of what we should do in the society, independently of the rationality of the economic consequences in the short run.
Why is it possible that other financial actors, not only BlackRock, but many others, including central banks. You may know, for example, that the Italian central bank recently decided to get rid of all fossil fuel-related assets. So it's all the assets owned by the Bank of Italy, which is a huge amount of money, are not invested in fossil-related companies, which is an important decision. Why is it not a decision taken by all central banks, by all investors, all pension funds? It would be easy to change the world.
Of course. Of course it would be easy, but again, speaking about cooperative agreements and the sanctions in order to put them in place, of course, you have plenty of implications. And again, the short term would be problematic for many of them. I think it's more, again, it's a medium-run kind of war that we have to win. And culturally, we can do way more. Because, for example, media are doing a horrible job, in my view. And as universities and as schools also, we could do much better than we do today. Promoting research, which, again, is interdisciplinary. Trying to even teach more in detail these topics and the problems that come out from these topics. We can do much more than we have done so far.
Yeah, Stefano was also, and then
just to add something, I mean, because I've been part of this kind of debates or conversation in other situations in the years before, and one of the themes was always what finance do for promoting, where the finance is moving. Well, I have to say, frankly speaking, that finance is repositioning himself very rapidly. I mean, I have on daily basis requests for making or for funding investments in my company for new projects. I have more potential funding than projects nowadays in my portfolio. Last year we had the first credit line with the credit spread linked to ESG performance we have, with a discount on market credit, okay, in between 5 to 10 basis points. Okay? There is a pool of 4 banks that lend us money, and they get the return that is lower if we overperform. Okay? But as a basic is on a standard that is just below the market cost. And also green bonds. I mean, we have been first in issuing a green bond in 2015 here in Italy, but then other companies follow. But now I have a queue outside of my door with banks that are coming to propose new green bonds. And also from the investor side, I mean, the situation is changing very rapidly, and we could map the situation on geographic basis. I do on roadshow twice per year all over the world, and I can tell you, when I go to Switzerland, France, Netherlands, Nordic region, I would say the majority of the investors ask me what is the position of the company on ESG performance, what is my commitment, what I'm doing to, let's say, deliver the pledge I've taken on plastic recycling and plastic reduction. They are asking me what I'm doing on the different dimensions of the commitment I wrote on the non-financial report. And that is the same, I would say, all across Europe. Then when you move to United States, you go to Boston, you get the same. You go to New York, different, okay? That is the situation, but I think it's not only Larry Fink that is moving toward this different perspective for financial, but it's a large group of investors that is going in that direction.
Karina.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because until 5 years ago when I joined the board of an oil company, and by the way was put there by the investors, I was an investor, so I was doing exactly those things that you were just describing. And I would say that basically there are 2 reasons why investors do not divest of fossil fuels, which is very different from what you just described. You're describing people investing in the positive innovations, which is a wonderful thing to be doing. But the dilemma is, what do they do about the old industry that has a very long legacy and still a very bright future, if you believe all of the projections. And there are 2 reasons why they choose not to divest. A small minority do. One, they don't care. So there's still a pretty hardcore of people who don't care, or don't care enough to risk maybe losing out on the dividends. And then the other very big reason, and that's what's growing, and that's Larry Fink, and that's all the others, is to say, if we sell out, we lose a seat at the table. If we stay, and it's all the big funds, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, you name them, all the big pension funds, the Norwegian government petroleum fund, are very active in pushing companies to transition, right? So on Thursday, in 2 days, the Pope is going to be holding his second annual meeting in the Vatican with a group of CEOs of the world's major oil and gas companies, and the CEOs or chief investment officers of the world's major asset managers and pension funds to talk about this very issue. That is engagement. That's getting these people in a room. The investors have not divested. They have stayed in order to put pressure and to be part of that transformation. Now, the dilemma that this raises for some investors is, do they trust the big oil companies to have the ability to reinvent themselves? Or would it be more logical to just have their capital returned to them through sort of a natural, kind of gradual disinvestment and reinvest in companies like yours? And that's a very, very big question. That's another one that keeps me awake at night, less so than the climate, but it's a big one, because are investors going to be willing to accompany us on that transition? It's hard to say.
Jos. Yes, coming back to the theme that Professor Nordhaus brought on the table, and that is that economists have to have a very rational economic calculus, including the importance of a price on carbon. And I agree with everything that has been said here, but what is driving a lot of companies is their expectation on the future price of carbon. And I think that is perhaps what the Paris Agreement has changed. That is that collectively in Europe, we think that the carbon price may be today perhaps not more than 25 euros, but if we would do a poll with business leaders, what do you think the price is going to be in 2030? They all are going to say 40, 50 euros and beyond. Now, the beyond depends about what others are going to do. Now, the Chinese are introducing a carbon market scheme similar to the European one. Now, if the Chinese move on, then we know that approximately 40–50% of worldwide industrial and energy production is going to be de facto covered by a carbon price. And then comes the other part of the expectations. What about the carbon club that Professor Nordhaus was talking about? If these 40–50% would say, we are going to force through trade measures the other 40–50% to come on board. And I think that is driving a lot of rational decision-making by our companies in Europe and elsewhere, expectations about trade sanctions, and about the future development of carbon prices.
But you mentioned the 25 euro carbon price, which is, as I said before, providing a large revenue to the member countries, because it's delivered to each country in the European Union. What is the use of this revenue, which is going to be large, because 25 is really quite large, even though the auction component is still a fraction of the total, it could become much larger. But if they auction more and the price is going to increase, this large revenue will go to what? And what's the priority, and who decides the priorities?
The reality legally is that in Europe, we have the doctrine of our fiscal and financial issues that tax revenue or revenue from carbon markets cannot be attributed beforehand. So it has to go to the common pot of the state. We had hardliners in Europe preaching that up to the extreme. Not to mention them, the UK had a very hardline position that the EU could not predetermine the use of the funds. But what we got in the legislation was that the revenues of carbon markets should be used for climate-friendly purposes. Now, we ask every year the member states what they are doing with it, and between 50 and 80% of the revenues of carbon markets are being used for climate-relevant purposes, either support for innovation and companies, or international action, or local things, you know, like refurbishment of in energy efficiency improvements, infrastructure, etc. But it does not look as bad as you may think if you read the legislation. That's what I'm saying. But it would, of course, be much better, and we were setting aside the revenues of 500 million allowances for innovation in industry. Now, at today's market prices, that gives a pot of money of 10 billion euro only for companies to put innovations into the market that are low carbon in nature. To my knowledge, it is the biggest innovation fund that exists in Europe that encourages private companies to put low carbon innovations and investments into the market.
And can we expect a regulation to increase the share of auction permits?
We could try after Brexit, although we all hate Brexit and it is a disaster and all the rest of it. But it is due to the very proactive attitude of the UK that we could not have the should into a shall. And a shall is a binding legislative provision that we could not get into the legislation.
So you see Brexit as an improvement?
Well, then we have to review our legislation, and there are 27 others to decide with unanimity, which is not an easy thing in Europe to do.
Brexit's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Can I jump in on this one? Sure. So I'm half French and I'm half Canadian, so I'm going to tell you a French story and a Canadian story. The French story is the Gilets jaunes. Every single weekend, Paris grinds to a standstill, and there's vandalism, and it's all, as you know, triggered by people who originally objected to the implications of the carbon tax for the price of gasoline. Of course, other grievances have attached onto that, but that was the spark. Compare that to what's been done in the province of British Columbia in Western Canada, where some years ago, the government introduced a carbon tax on every product out there. And it was a difficult sell, but what they pledged was that every penny would be returned to the citizens. So every year, every man, woman, and child receives their carbon dividend check, or whatever it's called. And surveys show that people really like getting that check. And as between giving up the carbon tax or giving up the check, they'd rather hang on to their check. And so if it means buying apples that are grown in Canada rather than buying apples out of season from South Africa because they're more expensive, that's fine. They like getting their check. So we sort of alluded to, without talking about it, to the question of the just transition and all that. It's a huge problem, and we were blindsided in France by that. And we really, I think, should look creatively at some of these little examples around the world to make sure that we buy the peace, that we buy public support, and whatever it takes to bring people in, and I'm thinking of the coal workers in Poland, et cetera, those guys have to be on the right side of this historical change.
I fully agree to what you just said. In fact, the modalities of the ETS are that Poland and Bulgaria and Romania, who happen to be still coal-driven countries, receive more of the revenues out of the ETS in a very targeted manner to do the transition, to finance the transition away from coal. And they are actively doing that in those three countries that are still coal-driven. But of course, it takes a long time to have a dependency on coal from 80% of your economy to something 20, 30% and below. So we need to give them a bit of time, but actually they are doing it on the basis of the revenues of ETS. That is an additional incentive for them to do the transition.
I think we've been talking about many interesting solutions, from R&D and innovation to carbon pricing, finance, and the audience, probably those who are here tonight, gathered some ideas about what could be the solution to, or the solutions to address climate change. Actually, we launched a poll, and the poll asked the participants here, more than 100 among you replied. can we see the outcome of the poll of the 4 questions? So the first one was, what worries you most about climate change? Can we go back to the previous slide? Yeah. So this is the first question was, what worries the most about climate change? What one keyword? And you see the biggest one are the one identifying the dimension which worries more, and weather seems to be, extreme weather seems to be the most important one, biodiversity, but it's also ignorance, which is quite relevant in this table. Extinction is another one, so water. So the big ones are the fears, the impacts that you worry more about. Next slide was about the second question, what's the most important solution to decarbonize the economy? And you see here that the winner in this poll is renewables and low carbon energy, which is somehow obvious even because it's convenient. I mean, Stefano, you know this quite well. It's producing energy with renewables is now competitive with fossil fuels. So the top solution is renewables and low carbon energy, but the second one is sustainable consumption and behavior. The third one is sustainable production. And only fourth, green innovation. Energy efficiency, in reality, is a major instrument. And we can do a lot in terms of energy efficiency, but probably it's considered as an acquisition. We know about it. We know, even though you may, we can do much more. You may comment on this. Next slide. What climate policy is most needed? And you see that invest incentives to innovation and education, what you were saying before, education, the role of university is crucial. Second is carbon pricing. And the third one, but it's more or less the same, subsidy to renewables and low carbon standards. I get more or less the same number of votes. The last one concerns the Milan municipality. And you see that in terms of proposal for this city, the number one, largely number one, is energy efficiency in buildings. And see, what people want is to increase, to start by increasing energy. But I'll ask you, both of you, to comment on this, because you know the city and you know the Italian reality.
Few comments. First one, about the first slide, culture is key. As Peter Drucker said, okay, culture eats strategy at breakfast. Okay, if you don't have culture, we can have the best strategy that will not work. Second, energy efficiency. I think we are largely underestimating the contribution that energy efficiency can provide, because this kind of, let's say, lever, okay, can provide a tremendous contribution, because it involves everybody, from the single person at home and industries and the public administration. Public administration, especially in Italy, has to make huge announcements in that area. And I think that there is one core point that connects to policies. That is a suggestion. I think we are, whilst in CO2 we are measuring perfectly, and so you can improve what you measure, that is correct. In energy efficiency, we are too much relying on what single states declares as a commitment, as projects, but few countries really measure what is the real achievements that has been achieved. Okay, and Italy is one of the few. Okay, if you go, we made a study across different European countries on energy efficiency and energy efficiency policies, and we discovered that Germany, or even the most, let's say, popular countries in terms, as Merkel was extremely, let's say, accurate in understanding the implication of climate change, but in energy efficiency, the way they measure the achievement on target is just based on the standard numbers of single projects. No one goes to measure the real achievements, and instead in Italy is front running in that side. And possibly if, and that could be a suggestion, if we are able to create a sort of common rule for measuring energy efficiency, we could also set up a sort of energy efficiency credit market for Europe that could eventually even induce a more, let's say, active or action on that area. That is, as I always say, is the fifth fuel, the most cheap and the most environmentally friendly.
Gianmario, what is, not only a comment on this outcome, but also a commitment from Bocconi University. What do you plan to do, for example, becoming a member of CMCC?
Well, this is unfair. This is unfair. Let's talk about that later, during a cocktail. No, let me tell you, interestingly enough, because Milan is doing wonderful things, so I don't want to change argument, but the point is that Milan is really doing wonderful things, and I guess that the reason why people say energy efficiency is because Milan is really a leading player in terms of let's say, sharing mobile vehicles, electric vehicles, and so it's biking actually that can be rented very easily. So it's doing very well, and this is because we have been managed very well by a number of mayors over the years. And actually, now we have an extra mile, because if June 24 we're going to win the Winter Olympics, there will be further investment that can be pulled into additional improvement of the city. But to speak about Bocconi, we are enlarging our campus in these days. We are opening up the southern wing of the campus, which will be open on November 25th with the inauguration of the academic year. So I'll do also some advertisement. And the new part is totally energy efficient. And interestingly, again, this is demand pull. Students are pushing us, actually are pulling us to do better things. They want a campus which is plastic free. They want to have fountains all over. They don't want to see any more plastic bottles around the campus. And so we are now including a very important topic in the business plan 2025, in which we'll try to do the best coherently with the city of Milan and coherently with our values. And we'll support, of course, the association.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I mean, it was a great discussion. We need to stop it because of time limits, but thank you. And I would like to invite Lorenzo Riparini, who is very welcome. And you got some information about the City of Milan. He's the Assessore for Partecipazione Open Data of the Municipality of Milan.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. It works.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for the suggestion you just showed. Dear President Newell, Navarra, Bartolomeo, Director Tavoni, and Professor Nordhaus, dear panelists and guests, let me first of all welcome you in Milan on behalf of the entire city and on behalf of Mayor Giuseppe Sala. And thank you for choosing Milan and this unique location for the launch of such an important partnership between two prestigious research organizations committed on climate and environment. Resources for Future and the CMCC, the Italian Foundation for Climate Research. Milan and its administration strongly believe in partnerships with private sector and the NGOs for the pursuit of common good. The mission of the IAI is to improve decision-making on the environmental, climate, and natural resources through an impartial economic research. The new institute is committed to become a central point for in-depth research and political solutions in Europe and to link these with work internationally. The municipality of Milan has a full commitment in the sustainable development, following the direction established by the United Nations 2030 agenda. Recently, the report Science and the Future of Cities, published in Nature Sustainability 2019, has showed the relationship between urban sciences and partnerships, highlighting the need and the importance of creating stronger links between traditional sciences, humanities, politics, and practice, and encouraging the research and the joint action of the academic, the productive world, and the third sector. For years, Milan has been at the forefront in limiting the consumption of resources to ensure a circular economy, protecting the environment and fighting climate change through a variety of initiatives. I have some slides, maybe the second one can show you some, but maybe the, well, anyway, I can, okay, you can see some of this action plan. First of all, the adoption of a food policy against the waste for food, which was one of the legacies of the Expo 2015. Then the Sustainable Energy Action Plan that gave rise to a funding of 28 million euro for the efficiency of the private sector and for the change of the most polluting vehicles. You were talking about it a few minutes ago. That was one of the key issues you suggested us to do. Then the preparation of the Air and Climate Plan 2030-2050 and the drafting of the integrated resilience strategy. We have a directorship inside the municipality of Milan which is taking care exactly on the resilience of the entire plans in the city. Then we had improvement of the separate waste collection service, which has now exceeded 60% of the waste production, and the plastic-free campaign that was quoted a few minutes ago that involves shops and the nightlife areas in Milan. In transportation, an example was the first pollution charge introduced in 2008 and switched then to a congestion charge in 2011. Nowadays, the new mobility plan recognizes Milan as the best performing car sharing initiative in Europe. And in 2019, the municipality launched Area B, the largest low-emission zone in Europe. These actions are projecting Milan to the level of the world's big and smart cities. It was possible also thanks to the participation of networks and partnerships. As you can see in slide 3, there are some of these. The Covenant of Mayors, the International Network for Climate and Energy, C40s, 100 resilient cities, and so many international networks that allow us to share best experiences and have a confrontation with the best networks all around the world. But another important role had the commitment to experimentation, the involvement of different actors and the participation of citizens in policy making through referendum, consultation, co-design and data-driven decisions, which is my area of work. I was quoting before the introduction of Area C, so the first congestion charge in Milan that was due, first of all, thanks to the mobilization of citizens in 2011 and the referendum with 500,000 citizens pushing us to do strong policies against pollution in Milan. And recently, the University of Milan Bicocca showed the first Italian ranking on best performing cities in terms of sustainability and circular economy. The researchers relied on a series of 20 indicators to define a ranking among bigger Italian cities, and Milan was ranked first, followed by Florence and Turin, mainly thanks to the policies for reuse and recycling, the efficient use of resources, the public transportation offer, and the car-sharing system. Talking about the sustainability of Milan, we cannot stop but here. We are aware that we have to move forward. It is part of our spirit and tradition. And we think that a new leading partner as the EIE will be a great help for our city. So thank you once more for your initiative and good work to all of us. Thank you once more.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. I would like to thank everyone who has come. It's really a full room, so thanks for listening to this long talk. Some was technical, some was more mundane. A lot of that was really focused on the big issues in front of us. And I think, as in every wedding, or as Bill said, maybe this is a birth more than a wedding, and in a way, sounds even better. Now it's time to celebrate and have fun. So welcome me in the second part, which is the more fun part. But first, welcome in thanking all the people who have organized this, Base, who has hosted us in this beautiful place and environment, and all the staff at the Institute who has helped making this possible. all the panelists and Bill especially. Of course, it was very difficult to get Bill to come here, as you can imagine. He's overwhelmed by a request of speaks and talks all around the world, and this is a very hot topic and a very recent award as well. And of course, special thanks also to Johannes and Maria Esther, who played with us before, and a special thanks to Laura Pellizzolo. I don't know where you are right now, you must be somewhere, but you know, she organized everything, and without her this would not have been possible.